Hello, friends. I'm your Vitamin to Vegemin girl. No, not really. But my kids and I have been watching a few select episodes of I Love Lucy, so that speech is a little bit popular around here right now. I can do the whole thing, but I won't because we've got questions, and we've got great questions. We've got questions about how do you keep your villain from being too obvious? How do you wed together the big beats of your mystery and your character's kind of internal struggles? And just lots of great questions. But first things first, if you can kind of give me a wave or a thumbs up or just a yo in the comments, if you can hear me and see me well, then that would be awesome. And then I will just kick things off. And I see lots of people are here. Oh, Cole Sparks and Laura and Chris, Throwback Gaming and Leonard and Guess and Death Dares. I'm glad you're here because your question is up first. All right. So yeah, let's get right into it. All right. So Death Dares asks, I feel like the villain in my book is really obvious. How do I make sure the villain is not obvious? Okay, so there are two ways that you can handle this. And one is kind of the obvious way that I think you'll get this advice a lot. And then one is, I think, the cleverer and more effective way of doing this. So the first obvious way is just crowd them out with a lot of suspects. And you will do that to some extent. You're going to provide a few people who your reader might possibly consider a more likely suspect than your villain. But I think the more effective way to keep your villain from being obvious is to essentially disqualify them as the villain in some way. You want to include some information about them that makes the reader kind of, not consciously, but just sort of in the back of her head, dismiss them from suspicion. So this might be because they are an investigator on the case. They are actually a police officer. It might be because they are emotionally close with your sleuth, or maybe they just become emotionally close with your sleuth over the course of the investigation. It could be because they were attacked along with your victim, or at least appeared to be. It can be for lots of reasons. So I am on my Substack, which let me go ahead and just pop that name up there. This is my Substack called The Perfect Crime. And I'm going through right now in a lot of my entries just a number of classic plot twists that kind of always surprise you. And you do see them over and over in mysteries, but you can kind of make them your own. And a lot of them have to do with just placing the villain in a role in the story where we are likely to disqualify him from suspicion. So that's my advice there, and it kind of just almost always works. And then, all right, the next question I have is from Phoebe. Okay, this is a really fun one. Okay, so Phoebe says, my protagonist's redeeming virtue and major flaw is her high sense of morality and dislike for breaking rules, even for the right reasons. Of course, amateur sleuthing requires some eavesdropping, snooping, and lying to a suspect to get more information out of them. Any tips on how she can do this while staying true to herself and not coming across as hypocritical? Okay, so I actually was considering doing a sleuth somewhat similar to this. So I have some stuff to say on this. I haven't actually decided to develop this idea into a book yet, but I had the idea of a character who simply would not lie, who simply hates lying and won't do it. And so, the fun there would be watching her figure out a way to wangle her way through this investigation despite the huge restriction that has been placed on her. So I think, what you want to do here is kind of embrace this this extra challenge you've given your character and find fun ways to set her up against it. And, some of the practical things that she can do is I think she can trade for information without it being illegal or immoral. She can possibly eavesdrop. You mentioned that as one of the things that you think she shouldn't be willing to do, but it may be that she can hear some information in public places that wasn't necessarily intended for her, but that still she hasn't really done anything wrong by listening. She may possibly be able to pretend she has information that she doesn't. Just um perhaps actually speaking a lie would be too much for her, but perhaps she can sort of say things that are close to the truth. She can say, "Oh, I heard that the Duke had some secrets," and then she hopes that the important secret is going to spill out of the person she's interviewing, even though she's referring to kind of a much lower level secret that she actually does know about. So she can pretend to know a little more than she does. She can kind of use her words to carefully skirt lying. And she might possibly be able to engage in a little light blackmail. I don't know how your character would feel about that, but she might feel that if somebody has done something wrong, she has every reason to turn that person in. And yet, if they will help her by giving her information, she might be able to kind of count that against their account and not turn them in. But I guess the other question I would be asking myself in your position is, am I going to force her to break this rule? Because this is one of the things that I think is it's really exciting often in a mystery when you just force your character to do something that they will not do. And kind of the right place to do that is about at the 3/4 mark, where they've been pursuing this case just as hard as they can, or at least they think it's as hard as they can. And yet they have held something back. And right here at the end, before we get into assembling the final clues, this might be a place where you could consider allowing your character to stack up the greater good against her personal belief. And I think we all have a point where some vastly important thing uh is more important than living strictly by the rules. I don't want to imply that your character should not be true to herself, but like for example, if she knew that if somebody had come to the door and was looking for the next victim and she knew that that person was in desperate danger, she might be willing to lie and say, "Oh, the victim isn't hiding in my bedroom." That there may be a reason that you can force her to break the rules, and that might be a really exciting position to put her in. All right, I'm just going to scan through the comments really quick. Uh, Let's see. Leonard says another way to use the rule obeying for the character by other characters not believing that someone would follow this rule, not lie under this circumstance. That's actually really interesting. I like that a lot. That sounds really clever. All right. So my next question is all right, this is from Leonard. What's your favorite mystery writer from the early 1900s? And I know you said you can't say Agatha Christie or Arthur Conan Doyle. Okay, so I know that you have tried to establish some rules here, but I feel like I have to say Agatha Christie because yeah, she's the one who I am most familiar with. I have read some Poe, I have read some Raymond Chandler, but if you want like an informed opinion, it's going to be Christie. And the reason why is just that incredible assembling of puzzle pieces and also the incredible twist that you never saw coming. And so sorry, but that one is my favorite. And then you also had another interesting question, which was, what's a technique for storytelling, killing, or sleuthing that is used in early mystery novels and isn't in use today and which you think would still work? Okay, so here again, I come back to some of like those really big Christie twists. Like, for example, the one at the end of Murder on the Orient Express, spoiler, where we find out that all the suspects contributed to this murder. So, that's a twist that I have seen almost never, other than that one book. I think it's used in one episode of Monk, but I feel like it's a twist that should still work and would still be exciting. And another thing I often don't see anymore is cases of mistaken identity. Somebody um, intended to kill a particular victim, but accidentally killed another. And I think the reason is that mystery writers think of it as more of a cliche now. So I was actually writing about this for my Substack this last week. Don't mean to keep plugging the Substack, but it is what I'm working on. So a lot of my thoughts relate to it. And I was writing about the mistaken identity twist. And then I was like, you know what mystery writers often do these days is they do sort of a not so mistaken identity twist where the sleuth imagines that this must be a case of mistaken identity because the victim was in costume or because someone near the victim was an obvious target. And they figure, oh, the wrong person got killed. And then at the end, we find out, nope, right person got killed. But the mistaken identity twist, I think it still totally works. It's fun because in order to figure out what the motive is and therefore who the villain is, we usually have to know who the victim is. And if we don't know who the intended victim was, then, we're kind of on the back foot and we have to unravel a lot before we get to our solution. And just to tell you guys what the Substack is, this is it's just an online newsletter essentially where I am writing piece by piece a book called The Perfect Crime, which is just all of my mystery writing ideas. So it's everything. It's the alibis, it's the twists, it's all of it together. And you can sign up for free, and then you get usually about every third newsletter, or you can sign up for $5 a month, and then you get every chapter as I'm writing it. And this book will eventually be published for everyone to see. But right now, this is the way to kind of see it while I'm working on it. And let's see, what is my next question here? Okay, okay, let me just read the whole question. Yeah, Jeremy says, do you have tips for a detective story that begins with the victim already dead? Okay, well, first I would say, don't forget that this victim is a character, even if they are dead when the story starts out. So your mystery is not just about who done it, but it's kind of about the whole moral and emotional story of why this murder took place. What bad thing happened within this community of characters that caused tensions to eventually break out in murder. And that is, the victim is a part of that. So if they are dead when the story starts out, then you still have to figure out a way to establish their character. We need to hear people talk about them and perhaps see the effects of how they've lived their life, but we need to not give them short shrift just because they don't actually get to appear walking and talking in any scenes. And then the other interesting thing I would say here is you might think about if you want to start a novel where the victim is already dead, you might think about starting this in what I call the escalated cover-up part of the crime. So again, if you're on my Substack, this is a graphic you'll be familiar with, but basically the crime starts with the trigger, the point where the villain decides to commit the crime. And usually that's going to be because he was put under pressure of some kind, maybe financial pressure, maybe just he's put in a dangerous position. And then preparation, the actual crime. There's the immediate cover up where he cleans the scene, hides the body, gets rid of evidence, this sort of thing. And then usually there's an escalated cover up, which is where things have sort of started to fall apart for him. And he is having to commit subsequent crimes. Maybe he's having to eliminate witnesses. Maybe he's trying to create false evidence and plant it. This sort of thing. And then finally, the confrontation with the sleuth, between the sleuth and the villain. So escalated cover up is actually, it's a great place to start a story because your victim is committing his subsequent crimes and we don't yet know why he's doing it. We don't yet know what initial crime these things hook up to. So a great there are a lot of Monk episodes actually that begin with the escalated cover up. And it's really good because this character is doing something sort of that seems inexplicable. Um, and we have to dig back into the crime to figure out what. So, one really good one was where there's this man who is stealing a number of pies. Okay, he's stealing these cherry pies from all of these community events. They're being used for like a big community fair, so they're being given out as prizes for different events. And he keeps stealing the pies, and it's very inexplicable until we learn that he murdered his wife in their kitchen right after she had finished these pies. And then the fair coordinator arrives at the door. He quickly shoves the pies at her and hustles her out of the way so that he can clean the crime scene. But when he does, he finds that one of his shell casings is missing, and he realizes it must have landed in a pie, and he wants to get it back before it winds up in police hands. So yeah, so that is a really fun thing to do if you want to start with the villain already dead, is think of, what your villain is going to have to do to keep the crime under wraps, and would you consider starting your plot there? So I'm just going to check through my comments. Let's see. Let's see. Okay, Throwback Gaming asks, how would you suggest to write a mystery like Christie's ABC murders, where several people are killed, but only one person is the real intended victim? Okay, so that is a great plot. That is kind of a unique Christie twist that actually you don't see a lot. We were just talking about that. So in this book, I think three people are killed, and one person's initials are AA, the next person's are BB, and then CC, and we eventually find out that only the villain only really had a motive to kill CC. He killed A and B just to make it look like the effects of a serial killer. So that is really the essential twist, is that you want your villain to be trying to go for the narrative of a serial killer. Remember that our villains usually create several narratives that kind of establish their appearance of innocence. The narrative of, oh, this death must have been the effect of a serial killer, is a narrative intended to basically disqualify the villain from consideration. We would never consider this, this victim's wife to be a serial killer. Therefore, it must be somebody else. It must be somebody else in the community who's targeting all these three people. So I would say that definitely keep that serial killer narrative in mind. Another thing you can do is draw a clear line of connection between the victims. So there's a clear line of connection, right, from A to B to C. We know what we kind of have an understanding of what the MO of this fictional serial killer would be. And so you might also consider drawing a clear line of connection by having them all be in the same profession, or all are of the same age, or all were at the same location on a particular night. But if you if you draw a clear line of connection between them, then the police are obviously going to focus on that connection between them as being revelatory of the motive, and they may completely miss the real motive. All right. All right. What are your mystery pet peeves? Okay. So one of my pet peeves is the dumb cover up. Okay. So the plot we were just talking about with the pies, this is kind of a dumb cover up. I feel like rather than showing his face at a number of community events and taking these pies and making himself very, very obviously a person behaving weirdly, this guy might have simply decided to just let it go. He might have simply decided that probably the person who finds the shell casing is going to just throw the pie away in disgust and not assume that this bullet came from a murder. Um, he might have simply decided to let it go. Or another plot I've seen with a dumb cover up is where this man was having an affair with a girl and of she dies of anaphylactic shock because he's been making this honey ice cream and she is allergic to honey. Um, and so then he hides her body under his ice cream store. And I was like, this is crazy. You should just take the consequences. Just allow your affair to be exposed rather than hide the body. And now, if somebody ever goes looking for her and finds her, now you're on the hook for murder. Now you're going to have a very hard time explaining that actually, the death was totally innocent, just an accident. It's just that I buried the body under the store. So that is a pet peeve where the villain sort of fails to make a reasonable calculus of whether it makes sense to get in deeper. Not that we don't sometimes fail to do that in life. And I kind of hate characters who are sort of cartoonishly evil. I kind of hate villains who are too well hidden. I want to see your villain. I want to get a chance to pay attention to your villain, to remember your villain, to have an impression of him before you spring him on me at the end. I don't want it to just be a character who was briefly mentioned in one scene and didn't make an impression. But probably my biggest pet peeve is just when we don't get a big surprise at the end. So who done it is never enough for me. Like the ending that I hate most is when we have the sleuth sitting around the drawing room with his his group of suspects, and we kind of know why each person might have done it. And at the end, it's just one of them, and it doesn't come as a surprise. It doesn't feel like, oh, we had a belief about who this person was, and now we have learned a new piece of information that totally turns it on its head. So that's probably my biggest pet peeve, when it's just a basic whodunit and we don't get a surprise at the end. All right, so this was a great question. How do you know when a book is ready for publication? I've been through 4 drafts of my novel and I'm feeling good about it, but I know some people go through 7, 8, even 9 drafts. How do I know when to take the next step? So this is a really tough question sometimes, and especially if you have been through 4 drafts, I suspect it's a question that you cannot answer for yourself. You just kind of can't even see the novel at this point because you've been looking at it so long and you have all those discarded revisions still kind of layered in your head, and it's too hard. You need somebody else to look at this and tell you, yes, go ahead, or here is where I think work needs to be done. However, here's my second answer to this. If you've done 4 drafts, I think probably you are good to go. Probably it is right to go ahead and take the next step. So, and I really identify with where you are at this point. Like, you've already invested a massive amount of time and energy and love in this book, and you don't want it to fail for you having failed to go just an extra quarter mile, but here's the 2 things I would say to that is, first, you have more to give than this one book. It is at some point appropriate to decide, this book is the best I have been able to make it at this point in my writing journey, and it's time for me to go ahead and iterate. Go ahead and see what the publication process looks like. Go ahead and take what I've learned in writing this and apply it to writing the next book. Because this book is not all that you have to offer the world. You have others inside you, and you need to make room for them. And I know that some writers do 7, 8, 9 drafts, and I wouldn't wish to denigrate their process, but I don't think I would look at them and say, because they have done this, I too must also. I don't think there's something particularly virtuous or correct or necessary in doing work twice. I think you want to do the work as few times as you can while still keeping it up to your standards. And I think if you've been through it 4 times, you are most likely there. And I wish you great success with your book. And then, yeah, this is another question in the same vein, but kind of a little bit different. How long would you say to take on a first draft? Do you think it's more useful to take your time on a first draft or to get a fast draft done as quickly as possible to get the story fleshed out and identify plot holes at this point? Okay, so this is also one of those difficult and very personal questions. I am Miss Plotter, and I think I've made that point of view very clear on this channel from time to time. But that doesn't mean that I don't ever have the question of, okay, well, should I forge ahead or should I stand back and strategize for a bit? And the reason, so let's go back to the reason why I believe so strongly in plotting. It's because, again, I don't want to do work twice. I want to do it once. I want me, the planner, to be kind of the executive of the company, setting strategy, looking at kind of all of, the big bird's eye view. And then I want me, the writer, who's actually sitting down and producing prose, I want to be like the employee. I want to sit down, put my head down, do the work in the knowledge that somebody else, which is just me at an earlier date, has looked at the overall strategy, and that I won't be asked to do this work more than once. But again, as a writer, sometimes you do have to do it more than once. But you want to limit that as much as possible. So I would say, if you talk about fast drafting. So if this fast draft is how you are establishing the plot and how you are kind of establishing everything and getting to a point where you can receive feedback, then I would say get through it as fast as possible. Now, if instead you have a plot and you are now trying to produce the first draft from a plot that's already developed, then I would say, in that case, I would say take a little bit more time with it, because there's an advantage to getting to the point where you can receive feedback so that you can take a moment to strategize again and then do your work, your next tranche of work, as it were, in the most reasonable and strategic way possible. There's an advantage to getting to that place where you can get feedback, but you also don't want to do your work so sloppily that just purely based on the quality level, you will have to do it a second time. I would say get to the point where you can do feedback as fast as possible, get that feedback, and then stop and strategize and do as clean a draft as you can. I hope that was clear. And I'm just going to scroll through my comments again. All right, so Matt asks, how do you create a murderer who you disqualify because of his size or whatever, but then make them qualified without making it laughable, like in Friday the 13th, where the killer is an old lady? Okay, so I'm afraid I have not seen Friday the 13th. Is that the one with Mike Myers and his mom is the killer? I have not seen it. But yeah, I mean, you just make it, the way you make it not laughable is by providing clues that that let you see how in fact the murderer is qualified, how in fact so you say disqualified based on their size. So perhaps the murders were very violent, we assume it's a big tough guy. Don't know what that was. It turns out to be, a little lady, and then we have to see how, oh, well, actually, these murders were committed with the use of a tool that allowed her to, um, to create more force than she normally would, or actually, she had more force at her disposal than we knew because she's been pretending to be weak or whatever. But we need to see clues that then make your murder qualified. Um, okay. And oh, okay. This was a really interesting question. Uh, okay. Michelle says, I'm currently working on a first draft. I did the planning for it, although now I'm halfway through. I feel I didn't do enough, or at least I didn't know how to spot problems I might face. I feel like I have too many scenes where the sleuth is searching places. Can these scenes be too monotonous? They're discovering things that do progress the plot, but I worry that it might be boring. I also see the benefits of having a sidekick, as my character is left to think things out rather than share and bounce ideas off another person. Do you recommend always having a sidekick, or can it work without one? Okay, so yeah. So let's deal first with the search scenes feel monotonous. I think what you want to do is go back to yes, but, or no, and furthermore. So this is a tip that I picked up from Gillian Perkins' book, How to Write Killer Fiction, and it's one that I've mentioned a lot in my videos. But essentially, let me give you the summary from the book. There are 4 possible answers to, does my sleuth get what she wants? In this case, does my sleuth find that next clue that she's looking for in her search? Yes, no, yes, but a consequence, and no, and furthermore, a consequence of looking for that stuff. So yeah, you want to remember that you are writing scenes, and each scene is kind of its own exciting little story, and some of them should not take us to a predictable location, like just getting that next breadcrumb of the mystery. Some of them should surprise us with a big consequence for having sought this thing, like somebody knows now that she's on the case and now she's in danger, or she winds up in an awkward social situation because somebody caught her searching their room, or things like this. But you want to kind of, you want to give some surprises to your reader at the end of the scenes to kind of, keep them entertained, because it's not all about that one big surprise at the end. It's also about like the whole journey being exciting and unpredictable. And then to your question about, do you need a sidekick? Well, a sidekick can be nice because you mentioned those introspection scenes where the sleuth is kind of tooling over the case in her mind and trying to put the pieces together. And those can be really nice with a sidekick. They can kind of add an extra dynamic to the scene because, because the sleuth and the sidekick may have different viewpoints. They may have a conflict that is outside of the case that is coming into their introspection together. But I think that there may be legit reasons why you just don't want a sidekick for this particular book. There's just some reason that it's not working for you, and I totally think that these scenes can work without the sidekick. So one thing you might have your sleuth do is, I mentioned your sleuth and sidekick having a conflict that is coming into play into their introspection. Well, your sleuth can have the same thing with herself. Your sleuth can deal with her self-doubt, or her vanity, or her feelings of inadequacy during this scene while she's trying to puzzle everything out, and she's wondering, do I have enough wherewithal to solve this case? I feel so confused. Another thing is, she doesn't have to be sitting in her room figuring this out. You can get her out into the town. You can have her walking around. You're showing us scenery. Maybe she's seeing things around her that are sparking ideas and helping her to kind of unravel the case. So I think that there are things that you can do to keep those introspection scenes interesting, even if you don't have a sidekick. And then this is yeah, I put these questions together because they kind of dovetail. Hi, Jane. Do you have any tips for breaking up the monotony of my detective interviewing 5 suspects? I've made the venue for each interview different and have the suspects doing different things, but I'm not sure having 5 interviews in a short period of time makes compelling reading. So, yeah, I think I might consider just breaking those up with some other scenes, perhaps some introspection scenes or some scenes where your sleuth is having to deal with whatever her personal subplots are. I might consider just breaking them up in time, but then also consider that your sleuth doesn't have to simply sit down and ask questions and receive answers. She can use verbal tricks to kind of get what she wants and to fool the suspect into revealing more than she intended. She can bribe the suspect. She can use deceit. You can also put her in an emotional squeeze. Maybe she's in this interview and she starts to feel really bad for this suspect and doesn't feel exactly good about what she's continuing to do. So you can do a lot of things that um, are going to make these scenes interesting reading, just by forcing your sleuth to work through them, forcing her to change strategy, forcing her to kind of be clever than the person who she's interrogating, and those can be really fun scenes. All right, I'm going to go back to my comments. um uh, all right. Okay, this one is also really fun. Okay, from Florida's Yesteryear. My first love is science fiction and fantasy, but as I go over television shows and books I watch and read, I have a heavy dose of mystery, X-Files, Grimm, the Dresden Files. So how do I incorporate science fiction into a mystery story? Okay, so the first question I would ask myself if I were you is, um, you've got this book that you want to write. How do you want to market it? Because if you want to market it as a sci-fi or a fantasy, there is probably no problem. Mystery slides so easily into almost any genre, into fantasy, into Western, romance. Every genre can use a little bit of mystery now and then. So you mentioned the Dresden Files, and I often think of those as hard-boiled detective novels, except the detective is a wizard. But there's nothing about those books, nothing about the marketing, nothing about the covers that would make them look weird in the fantasy section, which is where they're shelved. They completely work as fantasies, despite the fact that they have a strong mystery element in every book. Um, and then, but let's say that you really do want to shelve this in mystery. Let's say that um, let's say that you're going to do kind of a very traditional sort of mystery and you're going to do that nice drawing room scene at the end. And you just feel like the readers who are going to enjoy this book are going to be mystery readers. In that case, I would say that, be mindful of the fact that your sci-fi elements are your hook. They are the reason why the reader is looking at all the mysteries on the shelf and deciding, oh, yours looks like the one I want to read. It's probably for those sci-fi elements um, that should be apparent in some way on the cover. And then what you want to do is, once that reader decides to buy this mystery because this hook looks so good, you want to deliver on that. You want to make sure that they get to explore the ins and outs of your sci-fi world. And then the last thing I would say is the more that the solution to your mystery depends on the fantasy rules or the sci-fi rules, the more you must be clear and consistent about those rules. So, like, if, for example, you were going to write a murder mystery that takes place on the Starship Enterprise, and this involves somebody beaming into, an area with a force field, which you're not supposed to be able to do. You're not supposed to be able to beam through a force field. But they use some sort of phase converter or whatever they use to make this possible. You would need to be very clear about what the rules are, when you can beam, when you can't. You would need to establish the existence of a phase converter before we get to the big finish. You wouldn't want to reveal that as part of your ending. You just want to reveal that it's a thing that exists, but perhaps should not be accessible to the villain. And then at the end, you reveal how they actually managed to use it. So I hope that helps. Just be really clear and consistent about the rules, and yeah, lean into it. If that's the kind of mystery you want to write, then do it up big. All right. So, all right. This question is, how do you pull off an unreliable narrator in unreliable narrator did it in mystery? Okay, so typically what this will involve is some reason why. Okay, there are two kinds of ways to do this. This is a twist that I call too close for crime in the book that I'm writing. And so if the sleuth actually did it, there are two ways to do it. The first is that the sleuth has an altered perception of reality. They don't know that they did it. And yet they did. So this might be because they are an alcoholic who blacked out. It may be because they were hypnotized. It may be because that I'm having a difficult time thinking of ways of altering your mind and your memory, but there's actually a lot of them out there if you go looking. So they have some sort of altered perception of reality. And then the other way to do it is where they know full well that they're guilty, and they use sort of little verbal tricks to kind of skirt the letting the reader know that they're guilty. They just eliminate the information about the actual murder from their account, and they use little verbal tricks. So I'm going to use an example here from a book which has this twist, which spoiler, 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 spoiler. It's going to be Agatha Christie's The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, in which the villain is a doctor who has killed Ackroyd, and he's set up a dictaphone to sort of time shift Ackroyd's murder to create the impression that Ackroyd was alive after he left. So he does this. Then he pretends to get a call from the manor, alerting him to Ackroyd's death. He goes to the manor and is left alone with the body. And we have this cute little line, which is, "I did what little needed to be done," by which he means he cleared away the dictaphone and made sure that there was no evidence pointing to him as the murderer. But as the reader, we are meant to assume that he checked Ackroyd's pulse and perhaps closed his eyes or whatever. He did doctory things. So that is the way to pull it off, is to just be really cagey with your writing and eliminate certain details if your sleuth is aware that they've done it. And if they're not aware, then you want to give them some sort of altered mental state that would allow them to commit crimes without knowing about it. And let's see. Okay. Fiona asks, "Wait, do you think proper snowbound mysteries, where there's a snowstorm and the suspects are stuck in a place where the police can't reach a phone signal lost thanks to bad weather, and the suspects just accepting that no police will turn up is a cliche? I worry that this is just too much plot convenience for the reader to find believable, but can't figure out another reason that the police wouldn't be called." I think it's reasonable. I think that there are some places in the world where at some times you just wouldn't be able to reach the police right away. I think lines being out due to a storm is reasonable, and that should probably take care of cell phone coverage as well. If you feel like it's too cliched, you can always have a character comment on it. You can have a character say, so you mean we're just totally cut off from the outside world, and then another character will be able to come in with the explanation that justifies, yes, you are cut off, and here is why. Another thing I want to say is that let's talk generally about the concept of cliches in mystery writing. So the that's where I thought your question was going at first when I read it. You talk about the traditional snowbound mystery where we're actually in like a mountain chalet that's been snowed in and cut off from the world, and I thought you were asking, is this too cliche to work? And the answer I would give to that is that mystery is a genre that loves the classics. It loves the classics. And so I would not be afraid of starting a story like that, but when you use one of these kind of classic plot tropes, the question is always, how are you going to freshen it up so that it feels just a little bit different from what people have seen? You want to give people the same thing but different. So we could talk, for example, about Glass Onion, where it is a very traditional mystery trope. We've got a group of characters with a bunch of old secrets gathering alone on an island, and and I think the way that they tried to freshen that up was with a bunch of tech, a bunch of really interesting visuals. I don't know if it quite got there to the point where it felt like something fresh and unique. But that's kind of a question you want to have in your mind when you start a nice, tropey, classic kind of mystery is, what can I do to kind of skew this a little bit and make it a little bit different? And then I'm going to switch back to my comments here. Um, Sorry, guys, I do find it difficult to read and keep talking. Okay, I really don't want my protagonist to be too sanguine or goody goody. Can you make your protagonist more interesting in a cozy mystery? Yeah, I think absolutely, and you should. So, yeah, absolutely, they can. I think what you're asking is, can they have flaws? And absolutely, they can. They can have, big flaws. They can be bad at treating people well. They can be irresponsible. They can almost anything. And sometimes it's their flaws that really makes us love them. If you think of Sean Spencer on Psych, what we love about him is that he's sort of aggressively irresponsible and self-involved. And if you think about Adrian Monk on Monk, we one of the things that we love to see him do is just behave in a cowardly and unreasonable fashion about his many phobias. And absolutely, I think that in particular, if you feel that your sleuth is too goody goody, then you might want to think about giving them kind of a humanizing vice that kind of brings them down to our level where we can identify with them. All right. Let me see if I can find this whole question. Jeremy asks, do you have tips for a way to write a fun dynamic between two leads? I have a romantic odd couple. Ah, that sounds fun. And a father and son team that I want to write. Okay. I would consider for these trying to create a persistent line of conflict. So you mentioned a odd couple. So the odd couple refers to, a show called The Odd Couple in which one character is very messy and the other character is very neat, and they have this persistent line of conflict that is always, no matter what, going to draw them into conflict in scenes and in storylines. And that's what I would consider for your two leads. One of them may be a cynic and the other is a optimist. One of them may be somebody who really strongly believes in the rule of law, and the other one is sort of a little bit more loosey goosey on this and has a different idea of justice. One of them may be neat and one may be messy. One may be a strategist and the other is somebody who just rushes in where angels fear to tread. But think about giving them different different viewpoints on stuff that they can kind of bring them into conflict. And then they can also have conflict about particular cases and particular scenes. Maybe they're on a particular case and one person is sure that suspect X is guilty and another person is sure that they're innocent. Well, that's a nice conflict that can kind of create a fun dynamic, give them things to talk about in scenes that are more than just the nuts and bolts of the case. Okay, and then this question is from Throwback Gaming. It's about my sleuth and how she interacts with a detective in the story. The detective shows up on the cruise my sleuth is on. After they had arrived at their first island destination, he's there to look into a suspicious death. So here's the question. The detective isn't going to want this 60-year-old grandma going around playing detective, but she is finding a lot of information. How should I have both characters interact with each other? Also, I plan on having the detective arrest the wrong person and then have my sleuth have to prove her innocence at the end of the book. So that's really fun. And I think basically the answer from my last question is how you're going to do this. You're going to think about what's the fun dynamic, what's the persistent line of conflict that I'm going to create between this detective and this sleuth. And a very obvious place to go, a place that a lot of books go, and I don't think it's a cliche, I don't think it's something you can't do, is simply he doesn't want her involved in the case, but she has a darn good reason for believing that her efforts are needed. And that can be really fun. He keeps trying to shut her out of the case, exclude her from important scenes, prevent her from getting important information, and she keeps finding ways to work around him. That can be really fun. You could also consider having them have a moment sort of near the end where he admits that he needs her help. That could be really fun. And it is also fun the way you have it plotted where she's going to kind of show him up at the end. All right, I have time for about 2 more questions here. Pardon me. Okay. Laura asks, how do I weave my protagonist's career and boss conflict and the murder of her interview suspect together? Which one is the central plot that gets all the big beats? There's a romance subplot too. Weaving plots together is confusing to me. Okay, so yeah, this can be really difficult to try and figure out all these many threads that you're trying to work together. So there are 2 main issues that your sleuth is going to be working through that should get the big beats. Those are the acute issue, which is the case that she's trying to solve, and the chronic issue, which is whatever internal conflict or personal conflict is driving her. So it sounds like it's a conflict with her boss and perhaps about whether this career is right for her or whatever. So ideally, you kind of create big beats that bring these storylines together. She gets to a point where in order to make further progress on the case, she has to get deeper into her conflict with her boss. Maybe she has to go behind his back and do something, or maybe she has to actually make an ally out of him, or maybe she has to embrace a talent that she hasn't before, and that is sort of driving her towards whatever career is more suited to her. But ideally, in order to make progress on the case, she must make progress on her personal issue, and you kind of do that at a couple of major points. There's the challenge accepted, where your sleuth decides, yes, I'm going to pursue this case, and ideally that will force her to in some way come to terms with this chronic issue, this overarching issue. And then you do it again at about the 3/4 point in the novel, which is the beat I call go the hard road, where your sleuth, in order to make further progress, they have to dig deep and ideally do something that they would not have considered doing at the beginning. She has to truly make her boss an enemy, or she has to truly truly say goodbye to her career and piss her boss off in some way that she will never be able to come back to this job. And that's what she has to do in order to get that information that will allow her to start assembling the final clues. So that's the ideal way to do it, is to put all those big beats to force them to come together on both the personal issue and the case. And then the romantic issue, you do want to kind of weave that in and around, but it is nice when the case can kind of force the issue on the romantic plot as well, when the case can force your characters to be captured together in a small room where they have to work out their problems, or where your case can force them to be in a stakeout together where again they have to work out their problems, or where your case can force them to take differing views and kind of split for a little bit. This is really difficult to kind of figure out how you want everything to weave together, but it can result in a really, really fun book. All right, and then this is going to be, I think, our last question. For those of you whose questions I didn't get to, I'm sorry, but I am really, really excited that people are showing up for these live streams and that I have lots of great questions to answer. And I will try to, I don't know, I may try to do some shorts that would answer questions that got short shrift. But I really am just so grateful that you all are showing up and giving me these questions so that I can help and hopefully inspire some of you. So Brittany asks, is it possible to have a time-shifted murder going... Oh, this is not the... All right, I'm going to do two questions, actually. Brittany asks, is it possible to have a time-shifted murder going backward in time rather than forward? For example, the murder happened at 10, but the patsy, the person who has been framed for the murder, left town at 9, so the killer makes it appear to have happened at 8. I've only seen examples of it going the other way. So yes, it is a little easier to do it the other way, to make it appear that the murder happened later than it did. But you can absolutely time shift it forward, and usually this would require a bit of pre-planning, because the most obvious way to do a time-shifted murder is with a false attack, a particular moment where people think the murderer is happening, when they hear what seems to be a gunshot. It's not a gunshot, but when they later find the victim shot, they assume that this is when the murder occurred, or when they hear a scream and, this is not when the villain died, but when they find the victim dead, they assume that it must have been when the scream was heard. And there are several good episodes of Monk that deal with time-shifted murders that go forward, as you say. I think Mr. Monk and the Carnival, Mr. Monk Goes to the Theater are a couple. And if your villain wanted to time shift the murder, I guess backward is what we said. So it seems to have happened earlier than it did. And they didn't have the ability to do some pre-planning, then the only tactic I can think of using is to ice the body down. And depending on what level of technology your cops have, that may or may not work because, of course, you determine time of death by the liver temperature, not the skin temperature. So, but that might be a possibility. And then, all right, last question, and then we are done for the day. Okay, so I saw a piece of mystery writing advice that says authors should not make the villain too likable. This seems contradictory to me. Isn't it good if the reader doesn't suspect the villain and feels that sense of betrayal? Do you have any thoughts on this? So yeah, I am completely on your side here. It definitely comes as more of a sucker punch if you didn't really suspect the villain, and ultimately, I think it tells more of a real story. We don't have this just completely cartoonishly villainous character who is totally unlikable. We have somebody who has their reasons, bad reasons probably, but they have their reasons for having committed this terrible crime. So I like it when the villain, when we see their humanity. They don't necessarily have to be like the cuddliest character, but we see who they are and why they've done what they've done. And that means to a certain extent, we have to sympathize with them. We have to see their pain. Um, Now let's talk about why you're probably getting this advice, which is that the cozy mystery genre in particular, if that's what you're writing, tends to try and minimize distress for the reader. We don't want to see kids and puppies die. We don't want to see people in a lot of pain before they die. And um, to some extent, we may not want to see the most likable characters in our story packed off to the hoosegow. We may want to, we may feel a little bit brokenhearted for them. And I often do feel that at the end of mysteries, but I think ultimately you're trying to tell a real story. You're trying to tell a story about understandable characters who behave in a way that's interesting. And I think if you try to make the villain somebody whose fate we don't care about at all, well then it's hard to do that. It's hard to tell a story that really resonates with people and and gives them that kind of wonderful feeling of a story well told. So that is the end of today's broadcast. I want to thank all of you for being here today and the awesome questions, and I will see you again in 2 weeks.